Hello, welcome to Truth Not Tradition Online Bible Study for May 25th, 2016. I'm Tony Smario on my father BroSal YouTube channel, BroSal.org. So thanks for being here, guys. For me, some breakthroughs happening in a lot of ways this week with the scripture and with the idea of what we're fighting against, trying to get my mind around this seven-headed beast of Revelation that was before John's time, but is not in John's time. And so anyway, I think there's some scripture today that leads that way, but it's all been I've been trying to get my mind around the idea of a resurrection, because I'm still got lingering thoughts about this rapture. How is it that I believed in a rapture for all these years? And now I realize there's no evidence at all in there. There's catching away, harpazo, that Paul used for himself when he says harpazoed. Philip was harpazoed. Everyone's eventually going to be harpazoed, and the living shall not precede the dead. The dead will be harpazoed before the living. And we're supposed to comfort ourselves with that knowledge about seeing the dead again. So when you consider that the dead are harpazoed, that would be a resurrection, wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't that be what I'd call a resurrection? If they've been dead and now they're brought back to life and harpazoed, that's a resurrection. So I looked up resurrection, Dad, and it turns out it occurs 41 times in 40 verses in the King James Version. Several of them repeat. Matthew starts out in Matthew with the story that the Sadducees that came to ask him, the Sadducees which say there is no resurrection, and asked him about the 7 brothers who marry the same woman. Each brother dies, doesn't leave any children. And then they ask, therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? And then the Lord explains that in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God. I've heard that all my life in Christianity. And so the first question that came to me today, Dad, is, well, how's that jibe with getting my body back? If the resurrection means when Jesus returned, he returned and ate fish with his disciples and drank wine, I assume, or at least water, which means, Jesus must have defecated along with everybody else in his time, didn't he? You can't imagine a Jesus that, ate and drank but didn't have to go to the bathroom like everybody else. Remember, these people were looking for a sign of somebody who could just float around the sky and have, lightning shoot out of their butt. And, flames come out of their mouth and just be God in some sort of Ezekiel vision kind of way. That's a sign everybody wanted. That would have sure made it easy. If you're God, we know from the scriptures what God represents as, bush on fire that doesn't consume the bush, or these pillars of fire or smoke that led Moses, or, right, there's voices, thunder, and lightning, and all sorts of things that, visions of ancient days and chariots of fire and all these kind of things, right? Why not just represent that way? And instead, he comes as the meekest, the meekest of men. As one person I listened to said recently, traditionally we know him as a carpenter, but I'm not sure anybody ever saw him swing a hammer. His carpentry's not mentioned much. I'm not sure why we think he was a carpenter. perhaps if his father was. But he's the son of a carpenter, but he apparently ran away at an early age and then was astounding them in the synagogues. And so we don't know what he really did. It was a tongue-in-cheek way of pointing out that Jesus didn't exactly, it wasn't the picture of a 9-to-5er working a job. The Jesus we know was a homeless wanderer. And I'm just saying, if you encountered him, I'm sure you would have encountered a real person who not only ate, but also had to go to the bathroom occasionally. I mean, he probably didn't eat much because he was a faster, right? So, he wasn't overconsumptive, I'm sure. But still, the point I'm making is he was a natural person, and when they asked him, show us a sign, and that's why he said, wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Sure, because anybody that can show you some sort of magical sign. And the reason I'm spending some time with this, Dad, is because I think that's where I want to go with it today, is coming around to the kind of thing that's going to happen in the world. The sign that the world's expecting is probably the sort of sign it's going to see. Where the real sign was a man that rose from the dead. Right? 3 days in the tomb and he rises from the dead. And so the resurrection here is spoken about in 41 times and 40 verses in the King James. And I'm just going to pick a couple today. It was really interesting to read all of them, and they take us on down through, the final ones are in Revelation 20. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. And we've gone over the fact that those words aren't in my Bible. That the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. So, I don't know, were they added to the King James Version or removed from my version? I don't know. But this is in Revelation where the resurrection happens at this 1,000-year end of this 1,000 years, it says, although it prefaces that by saying that the ones that give their heads would rule and reign with him. And it says this is the first resurrection. So this one adds that the rest of the dead live after the 1,000 years, but in Revelation it sets this timing of a first resurrection at the beginning of the 1,000 years. This is the first resurrection. All right? Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power. But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Now, in seeing it again, I realize that could include the believers, all those that are the faithful followers of Jesus, that aren't just the ones that give their head at the end and don't take the mark, but are part of this, that are always destined to be part of this first resurrection, the true believers that really are going to rule and reign with him 1,000 years. Because I realize if this is the resurrection, then when are believers? When is this time when believers are this time Paul's speaking of, that the living shouldn't precede the dead, the harpazo part, when those that are alive will be caught away. Wouldn't it be here, at the beginning of the 1,000-year period, during this first resurrection? Wouldn't that be what the living are waiting for, to catch up to that first resurrection, not some rapture? As I say, we can't seem to justify that in the Scripture, but we can justify a first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. And if the King James Version's right, the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. And that jibes with something else that I'm hoping is going to be in these parts that I picked out today, because I don't want to have to read all 41 verses, which I did just this morning in preparation. And a couple of them just jumped out at me that I wanted to go over. I'm just looking through them now to see I guess there's so many that we should talk about. But I want to go somewhere else today, so I'm just going to bring this up, and it's easy. Blue Letter Bible, just search the word resurrection 41 times in 40 verses. You can go see what the word means, and anastasis, I think it is, and it's the one that occurs all 41 times. So this the same word, this resurrection. And what you do find, though, is that there is more than one. I mean, Jesus, the first to be resurrected, and then we're told about this first, blessed and he that is holy, that takes place in the first resurrection. Well, not that can't, that's got to be a designation of some other order of resurrections, doesn't it? Because it's not the absolute first, if Jesus was resurrected already. And then we're going to find that when he died, those that were resurrected at the time that he died, that's not this first blessed and holy is he that takes place in the first resurrection, right? That's a resurrection at the time Jesus is resurrected. So it's really not the first unless it's the first in some other series of resurrections, which would make sense to the King James Version that the rest of the dead live not again until the 1,000 years were over. It would seem perhaps there's a resurrection scheduled for the end of the 1,000 years, which, as we've talked about before, Dad, makes sense to me that it's doing it over again. The devil's going to be let out again, and the same. It almost fits what's been long taught as this pattern of reincarnation, right? The dead are resurrected. It's a type of reincarnation. It's just another, it's a different way. It's like everything surrounds the truth. All of our truths, all of our religious truths, where do they descend from if we don't come from the sons of Noah? And what knowledge do they have? And on the Sunday show now, I've been studying the esoteric Gnosticism and seeing how it's such a slight twisting of Scripture, where they use Jesus quotes a lot. The kingdom of heaven is within, and such things are, they're happy to quote Jesus as an ascended master, but they seem to leave out this whole part of the historic story about him being claimed to have risen from the dead, and this resurrection that's coming, and him eating with people, all this, the reality of who he was as the prophet that got resurrected to validate who he was. Not just some man that's claimed to have risen from the dead, but the one who came all along claiming to be the fulfillment of the prophecies, and that the prophecies demonstrated through Jonah, among others, that he would come out of the grave. Jonah said it had always been three days. So anyway, I find it interesting that in the Gnostic understanding, there's just no mention of everything we've learned in Scripture, and yet their metaphysic is very slick and much more refined than Christianity's version of this, the way Christianity sees the devil and evil, and the profane Christian version that the masses accept is, as I'm always saying, like sun worship, like worshiping the actual sun and imagining that devils are floating around the sky with angels fighting each other, that's where it's going on. And there's some mention in what we're going to talk about today, Dad. That's why I'm sort of laying this groundwork, because metaphysically there must be some other dimension, which is what all the esoteric people seem to understand quite clearly. But for them, Jesus is just a master to help us through this dark and dreary place called matter, to get back to spiritual union with the divine, And when they use the terms in the Bible, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, they all have this esoteric symbolism, right? It's the divine within us that's our Father in heaven, right? It's our own nature. It's our divine nature that's what we're being pushed towards. And it's the reunification of ourselves with the divine, our complete abdication of our ego. Which, it's very much like I told you, it's like the Buddhist philosophy in their esoteric version, only their nirvana, which is, complete, in the actual term of nirvana, is like to snuff out a candle. It's to cease. The terms they use in the esoteric teachings is to reunite with the divine, to become one with the divine. Which, and I always, wish I was in the class that I could ask, what happens to me? Of course they're just going to point and say, well, that's your ego talking. But if I don't, but what's left of me to separate me from the divine? See, that's the whole point. In the brand of Gnostic esoteric knowledge, that's exactly what we seek to discover, is a complete union with the divine where there is nothing left of me and you. We don't exist as individuals. Therefore, Jesus isn't an individual in the sense that that's how profane they imagine we Christians look at it. Jesus and the apostle as actual people. They read those scriptures and see symbolism in it. The 12 helpers, meaning the helpers to guide us on our inner journey of enlightenment to become reunited with the divine. It's all ways of talking around a theosophic reality in their Gnosticism. It's any way to not attribute life to a God that you worship or serve outside of yourself, or any sort of fulfillment that comes with you still as yourself and God still as God. And to the monotheists, of course, that is the idea, but our understandings are so thin and unsupportable. That's what I'm trying to get through and hope to help with the long-term conversation, is that I see a way. They even declare it themselves. They, like I say, they just don't call it God, but they declare the metaphysic, and it has to do with another dimension. They declare divine beings. They just don't call them, again, angels and demons and such would be representations of how we respond to impulses in ourselves on our path toward reuniting our divine elemental source, the spiritual source that's in us, to peel off all of the material, if you will, which is the ego in this esoteric view, to get down to the pure divine source, which is exactly one with the Father. Like Jesus, and I've seen him bring this up, that Jesus says, I only do what the Father does, right? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So they make that an example of what we're supposed to be. And in a sense, Jesus, he said, you'll do greater things than me. He said, heaven is within. He did say these things. So where do we as Christians get where do we separate this story? And the world is accusing us, the intelligent world, the esoteric world of gnosis and the mystery schools, accuse us of simply corrupting an ancient understanding of the path of the sun and buying into the fact that 2,000 years ago, some people wrote a story down that it actually happened to a man. And they took this Jesus that actually lived, and by some critics, was an ascended master. Alongside Buddha, alongside Confucius, all these ascended masters, Plato, sent into the world to guide us. They give Jesus that. They don't deny he existed and that his teachings are in, because see, they're Gnostic Gospels that they found at these Nagam, darn it, I got too much in my head right now, Dad, to the name's not in the top of my head. These diggings, these archaeological finds that date this small group of scriptures and other writings back to like the second, third, maybe third century. So just within a couple of hundred years of Christ. So these things are quite reasonable to look at as far as what they say. The Gospel of Thomas, and they got all these things that aren't canonized and are, the church has been calling heretical for years. And so I'm just getting into the reality of that. And I think a lot of it is quite heretical from where we stand. But it shows how close the heretical has always been to the real story. Or I'm still trying to go in our discovery on Sunday of the seven-headed dragon and the seven-headed beast, and what those really represent. This false story that's being sold to the world, and always has through the Jews, through the Kabbalah. It's the Kabbalah that they claim is the source of much of this Gnostic understanding. And the Kabbalah claims to be a source that goes back to the fallen angels, or by the people that don't. I should say that there's some groups, which I don't know if it's propaganda or not, claim that it goes back to the fallen angels. The Kabbalists themselves at the time would seem to claim it goes back to Moses. What they say is the 10 commandments and the law was what Moses gave the people. But Moses also understood the esoteric version of the law, what it all really meant, what we were really trying to achieve. And that's where the twist is, Dad, because what they say is this Kabbalah comes from Moses as being the esoteric understanding that what God's doing is simply giving us this rope to go out and hang ourselves so that we can understand how wrong that is, what evil really is, that we might come back to him. I mean, it's very close to my own metaphysical understanding, except mine doesn't have to do with this undermining of the ego, because that's not what Jesus taught. See, that's where I keep trying to draw it back to. If they're right, then Jesus is just a big scam, and everything he taught and everything that's said about him and all that didn't really happen. See, and that's the part that I think, for some reason, God has been able to build in the world. I'll build my church, my outcalled ones, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. They won't be able to undermine this story of the God that really did rise from the dead as proof that he was that his story's the real story. And his story is very simple. Everybody can do it. You don't have to be initiated. All this other stuff, I've been watching stuff now about the initiation process, see? It's all about breaking you down. They call it breaking down your ego. But it's breaking you down so you can be commanded now. You're egoless and you can follow the leaders they give you. And it's all put to you as something that looks very rational and very good. Nobody's asking you to slay children, take blood oaths, right? They're asking you to observe that our own desire worship is the sin that the Bible's talking about, which is, of course, is true. See, but they try and leave off the reality of a physical attribute, right? The thing that Thomas Aquinas seemed to be able to acknowledge as the mechanism by which God is able to interact through freedom. We're still free, and yet through the senses that we have, including our intellect, or especially our intellect by way of our sensuous nature, we are able to imbibe God's invisible existence, right? We're able to apprehend it. Even though we can't see it or touch it, we can see and touch things that have been made by God. Our mind can therefore get close to. You know, we can watch the movement of the planets. We can construct our sundials, let's say, to measure and become acquainted with the patterns, to become acquainted with the stories that are there for us to understand. And so I like the way Aquinas, I'm sure many philosophers have done this, but Aquinas especially stands out in my mind as bridging the gap between Aristotle's rational view of causation and the world of causality that we live in, the material world of, excuse me, physics, if you will, and then the philosophical world of the ultimate, the primary mover, the ultimate cause, what's behind it. And so Aquinas, starting from there as God the Creator, bridges the gap back to this metaphysical world of Aristotle to point out that, at least on one look at it, God creates this apprehendable mechanism in an apprehendable medium so that something can be known. What could it be? What did we read last week? The people, what did he have against his people? That they don't have any mercy and justice and knowledge of God. See, so these are the things that are supposed to, I guess, this is what we should know if Paul's right in Romans, just by what is made. If we were left alone to just sort of grow up in a family unhindered by external forces drawing us, tempting us, let's say, in other directions, then it should be clear to us what is right, what is true. And I'm not saying it is, because I can't prove that. I'm saying that that's the concept that Paul seems to be putting across, that God is apparent in creation if we were to have sort of unfiltered eyes that have now, been clouded by a world made darker or artificial or evil, whatever, adjective makes sense to you. And then, was that on purpose? It seems to be. See, in all the Hindu understanding, that veil of illusion that we're under, this short life that we think is everything, this ego that we think is the thing that we're most concerned with preserving, right? All that is a veil that is from God, is from reality, thrown over our eyes so that we might struggle through it to find what's good and what's right. All right. So again, back to this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'm hoping all these sort of strings are starting to make sense to the people that listen to me regularly, and they're starting to get a deeper perspective of Christianity than the one that we've been given. So I want to go to a couple places in the Scripture, since it's just a Bible study today, that have to do with the resurrection, and then even more. This first one, Matthew 27, records the resurrection and what happened afterward. But this part I want to read, starting at Matthew 27:38. It says, "And there were crucified with him 2 bandits, one on his right, one on his left. And those who passed by blasphemed against him, nodding their heads and saying, O you who can tear down the temple and build it in 3 days, deliver yourself if you are the Son of God, and come down from the cross. The high priests likewise were mocking, together with the scribes and the elders and the Pharisees, and they were saying, He saved others, but he cannot save himself. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, so that we may see and believe in him. He trusted in God. Let him save him now, if he is pleased with him. For he said, I am God's Son. The bandits who were crucified with him were also reproaching him. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice and said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, for this I was spared. I know it's always been taught to me, why have you forsaken me? And I've actually heard it taught before, Dad, that those aren't the correct transcription. This Bible says, my God, for this I was spared, and it has a rare notation here, very rare in this Bible. I guess an alternative translation says, this was my destiny, which again makes more sense than why have you forsaken me. Anyway, I don't know which it is, but my Bible says, my God, for this I was spared, or this was my destiny. Some of the men who were standing by when they heard it said, this man has called for Elijah. And immediately one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. But the rest said, wait, let us see if Elijah will come to save him. But Jesus again cried out with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And immediately the curtains at the door of the temple were torn in two from the top to the bottom, and the earth quaked, and rocks split, and tombs were opened, and the bodies of a great many saints who were sleeping in death rose up and went out. And after his resurrection they entered into the holy city and appeared to a great many. When the centurion and those who were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were frightened. And they said, truly this man was the Son of God. So that's the story the way Matthew records it, with the people mocking him. Here's a guy who'd been healing, right? What was his reputation? This guy had been healing people. Remember when he spit on the blind man, made the mud, spit on the mud and put it on the blind man, and the guy could see. He said, now go tell the Pharisees. I mean, why did he do that? Because it was the Sabbath and it upset them. He had broken one of their Talmudic traditions. And so, he'd been making them mad in the synagogues. We have plenty of stories of that. And so now here he is up on the cross, and they're saying, if this is the Son of God, if God's happy with this guy and all his stuff he's doing, why didn't he take him down? So just to put some flesh and blood on the moment, and whatever he cries out, whether it was, why have you forsaken me, or this was my destiny, the way my Bible records, some of the men who were standing by said he's calling for Elijah, and they're saying, well, let's see if Elijah saves him. But he doesn't, and instead he dies in the earthquakes. And this is the part, again, the resurrection. Do we believe this really happened? I mean, the Gnostics sure don't, but they don't have any argument for this, right? They just argue that it's a story that was made up, right? So this is all just a story that got made up. And we know that these Gospels got made up within 100 or 200 years, somewhere around that same sort of time frame that these Gnostic Gospels are claimed to have gone into the ground, about 280 after Christ. AD, I think 280 AD is what the diggings there at Naga, what do they call them? The Naga something scriptures because that's where they were found. And yeah, they date from about the 3rd century. And the Gospels date, much earlier than that for the most part. And the esoteric argument through the Kabbalah and the people that killed Jesus in the Talmud was about to be codified after the temple's destroyed. These guys figure they got to put their stuff, get it down now into writing before they lose it. So long before these Gnostic writings. So sure, they're old, but they're not as old as the teachings of Jesus if we're getting the teachings of Jesus. And the teachings of Jesus, again, can't really be separated from the identities that he is the one coming to save his people. He's the Messiah everybody's been waiting for, and the Pharisees don't buy it. They say, "What? No way. You're some poor wretch, You're saving people. I mean, you're doing miracles by some devil, You're possessed of some demon. Who are you to come and claim to be our Messiah? Tell us we're wrong." So, and I say that's a pattern. That's just natural. We read about it last week with what they were doing already with their worshiping the calf out of Samaria and making their amulets and whatever they were saying that was making God so angry he was going to destroy them. So this is sort of that's why I say the church should understand it's quite natural that we'd be disappointing at this point to the Lord. The fact that he's allowed his name to survive, that we ignorantly stand out here in the face of all this Gnostic knowledge, which probably is, much of it probably is quite divine, that comes down from the angels, right? There's got to be enough real stuff mixed in, like I keep saying, or who would listen? So even ignorantly, we stand on the fact that this Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. He was resurrected, and that there's resurrections coming. And that's the thing I think that's so impressive in the world, that even Augustine was impressed with. Because Augustine was much more aware of the arguments. Remember, Augustine lived in the 4th century, and he was much more aware of the Greek knowledge, the Persian knowledge. He was following the Persian Manichaean, the dualistic concept, which I'm always trying to get to the bottom of exactly what is that dualistic concept. But it's very much like what I've been studying now, this Manichaean dualism that comes all the way down now 1,000 years later. Aquinas is still trying to argue against it. And it's where Augustine came out of that thinking. So Augustine was a deep thinker confronting the deep thinkers of his time. And one of his arguments for Christianity was that it was simply be believed, that it was prophesied that it would be believed. And as the craziest story that existed, a man gets resurrected. God enters the meekest of men. He doesn't fly through the sky with, lightning shooting out of his fingers and fire out of his mouth and declaring, "I am God. Everybody's going to worship me." He arrives as the poorest thing on the planet, the meekest of men. Right? That's the whole catch in it all, but that's the depth in it all. That's what makes it not a myth like Zeus, but something that demands a metaphysical explanation. And so they've just written him off. The modern world of intelligence, that remember is foolishness to God. They've written him off as simply a misunderstood ascended master. I should say they've written us off. They've kept Jesus, but thrown away Christianity. And the more I study, the more I see how reasonable that really sounds, and why Christians need to, get their story straight, know their scripture, know what God really is, have a metaphysical system that they can argue that makes God and a Son of God that rises from the dead, something realistic, like Paul must have had. We don't have what Paul had. I'm quite sure of it. Because remember, Paul was walking around raising people from the dead and healing people. Paul said, I don't look like much and I don't speak with much authority, but I come with power. So don't tell me the Christian church comes with power today. Not that power. They have the devil's power. They have the world's power. They have the power of money and influence and, all things worldly. Still moving a people, though, that are saying, Jesus rose from the dead. So that's the miracle in it all. We're just ignorantly still worshiping Jesus. And so I think that's fantastic in the sense of God being able to keep that name alive without having to defend it through any sort of worldly rationale or metaphysics. And so for Christians, you don't. The people that are here, I've said that before. I'm not looking to tell you that your faith doesn't count if you don't, if you're blindly following traditions like the Pharisees were in the time of Jesus. Many of those people became part of the followers of Jesus. They saw the difference, though, right? They believed him more than they believed the tradition they were following. And if they didn't, then that was their own struggle. They had to, like the apostles. They were still feeling people had to become a Jew first. And then Peter has that dream and that encounter with Cornelius, the Roman, and comes back and tells them, because they ask him, "What, you went into a Roman's house to eat? In other words, you're breaking the law? We're supposed, how could you break the law? We got the tongues of fire on us. We're all zealous for the Lord. We're out converting people to this way of our Messiah, and you're going in to eat with Romans?" So, think about what that must have meant to them and what that means to us. Peter saw that God doesn't play any favorites. And so, this is the bigger reality of Christianity, that God does the choosing and can choose anyone he wants, and the people who know Jesus, who love him because they know he's the Son of God, will follow him. I mean, we taught that in John, Dad, when we went through John's gospel. I don't see how it could be any clearer. I mean, there is no other teaching. If you know the Father, he accused the Pharisees of saying, "You claim to be followers of Moses, but Moses talked about me. The Father knows me. So if you know Moses and you know the Father, you would have to know me. And if you claim to love Moses and love the Father, then you would have to love me too. And if you loved me, you would know me. And if you knew me and loved me, you would follow me." And so, that's all there really is to Christianity. It's just that the following part is this metaphysically upside down, or I should say philosophically upside down metaphysic of dying to live, right? Turning the other cheek, claiming nothing is your own, storing up your riches somewhere invisible. That's the crazy metaphysic, that the philosophy of following Jesus and being a servant. The greatest among you will be your servant. That's the philosophy of Christianity. Who embodies that? People like St. Francis, perhaps, or Mother Teresa, or Father Damien of Molokai. I don't know who else. There's others, but as I say, we don't usually hear about them. They don't tell us that very often. Every now and then the news stories have come out about someone. I know a local girl who gave her kidney for her mother. Her mother was dying and had to have an emergency kidney transplant, and her daughter happened to have a kidney that was suitable, and her daughter gave up the kidney for her mother. How's that for a real, how come the news isn't full of just story after story like that every day to inspire us instead of put us in fear? If you don't think that's on purpose. Anyway, let's get back to the scripture here, because this is what brings us into our time, I think, Dad, and keeps us on this same theme of the resurrection and when this is and what this is all about. And it's from Luke's gospel now. And I'm starting it right at the same part where we're at today, where these Pharisees come and are trying to trick him by saying, okay, and the Sadducees, who don't even believe that there's a resurrection, and say, what happens then? I'm sorry, it's not the Pharisees, it's the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, and they're saying, yeah, hey, Moses wrote that if a man's brother die without children, if a man dies without children, the brother's got to marry the wife. And so there were 7 brothers, and they all married the same woman. None of them had children, and they all died. And then the wife finally died. So who's she go to at the resurrection? So remember, they're doubting this resurrection, and they're trying to catch him in some sort of metaphysical slip-up. Whose is she at the resurrection? This is what the real message is today to me, if there is one. Therefore, at the resurrection, to which one of them will she be a wife? For 7 of them married her. And Jesus said to them, the sons of this world marry women, and women are given to men in marriage. But those who are worthy of the other world and the resurrection from the dead, neither take women in marriage, nor are women given in marriage to them. For they cannot die again, because they are like angels, and they are sons of God, because they are sons of the resurrection. Now, my first question of that first part is, when is that? Could that be this first resurrection? I doubt it, because they can't die again. And we know there's a second death. So I say this is after the final resurrection, and this is before the very end. Because otherwise, what's the use of having bodies back to eat and drink if you're like angels? Do angels eat and drink and go to the bathroom? So if the resurrection is the one that we've always been talking about, to have our bodies back like Jesus and be on the earth for 1,000 years, wouldn't we still be, even if we were celibate, there'd still be that possibility of having wives and such? Wouldn't people still be having wives? So what I'm pointing out is the resurrection is not something that is into this same body like Jesus had, perhaps. It's the body Paul talks about where, you can't be in heaven in a corruptible physical matter. And I guess where I'm trying to go, what does Jesus say to them? Sons of this world. Now, exchange that for dimension for a moment, okay? Just to get the point I'm making. Sons of this dimension marry women, and women are given to men in marriage. But those who are worthy of the other dimension and the resurrection from the dead, neither take women in marriage, nor are women given in marriage to them, for they cannot die again, because they are like angels, and they are sons of God, because they are sons of the resurrection. See, nothing about a kingdom on earth, right? This perpetual kingdom that God's going to rule on the earth. That's talked about where we had in Revelation, they shall be kings and priests on the earth. And rule for the 1,000 years, right? But this resurrection, I think, is the one where Paul's talking about putting on incorruption. This isn't to be in the earth, see? This is to be in heaven, as in another dimension, outside of matter. Now, concerning the resurrection of the dead, this is going on now, 37th verse, still in Luke 20. Now, concerning the resurrection of the dead, even Moses pointed it out, for he referred to it at the bush, saying, the Lord God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. And some of the men of the scribes answered, saying to him, Teacher, you have well said. And they did dare not again to question him concerning anything. So Jesus points out that when Moses refers to God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's saying everybody's alive to him. I mean, that's kind of interesting, right, people? These guys were in the grave, as we know it, the grave, but they're alive to God. And the whole Abraham's bosom thing with Lazarus and the rich man, the parable Jesus told. So, more evidence of this continuation of life until this resurrection. And when are these things? Okay, so let's go on here. And they did not dare again to question him concerning anything. And he said to them, how can the scribes say concerning the Messiah that he is son of David? Jesus is going to keep pushing the point, because if you get the irony here, they tried to trick him. He basically said, in the world to come, in the resurrection, people won't, be given in marriage. They're not in this dimension. They're in another world where they're like angels, and they don't ever die again. So this question has no meaning and after death. See, he doesn't mention an in-between time to these people, but they'll come back and be in their bodies and live in their bodies, in which case, whose wife would they be in their bodies? Or in that kind of body. He points it there. See, the Sadducees are pointing to this resurrection. This has got nothing to do with the Christian church, remember, now. He's answering their question about this resurrection that they don't believe in, trying to poke holes in it metaphysically. So how does that work, Lord, at this resurrection? See, because they're picturing back into bodies like Christians are always talking about. And Jesus is correcting them and saying that at the resurrection, people won't die anymore. They'll be like angels of heaven. Well, that don't sound like coming back like Jesus, like bodies. Or is it? See, I'm not making a conclusion. I'm putting out there that the traditional concepts have to be, opened up so we can fill in the blanks and get a clearer picture of what we're talking about. And this all for me descends from the discovery that the rapture isn't the rapture I thought it was. My vision of being, plopped back in my body after death to roam the earth again in a body. I'm trying to find the answer to that, right? And so I'm seeing that the potential is in this first resurrection. Okay, so let me keep going today, because I really want to get through this and then sum up a little bit. So we're still in Luke 20. After they don't dare ask him anything anymore now, because he's poked a hole in their metaphysics by pointing out that their whole question misunderstands reality, which they seem to know from this Kabbalistic stuff I'm learning. That's why he can refer to other worlds. They've got 10 Sephiroth, which are the lead up to the divine, which is the behind all of it. But the divine expression takes for them 10 different worlds, Sephiroth as they're called, through 7 dimensions, with only one of them on this side of the barrier, meaning matter, and the rest in a spiritual realm. So very much like my own conclusions, as you know, Dad. But my point is, the people Jesus are talking to, they may not believe in a resurrection, but the Kabbalistic teaching that would have defined their Talmudic understanding on an esoteric level was one in which they understood other worlds and other dimensions, and I think that's why it shut them up. And so then Jesus, after they don't dare say anything to him, comes back at him again and says, how can the scribes say concerning the Christ that he is son of David? And yet David said in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put down your enemies under your feet. If therefore David calls him my Lord, how then can he be his son? And while all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes, who like to walk in long robes, and love to be greeted in the streets, and take the chief seats in the synagogues and the high places at the banquets, those who embezzle the property of widows with the pretense that they make long prayers, they will receive a greater judgment. Right? So he uses one more example after they shut up to tell his disciples, right? It says, and while all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, right? The people are hearing this lambasting he's given the Sadducees about not even understanding what everybody seems to understand. There's another world, and in the next world, people won't have to marry or die. And then he points to their own scriptures. Now that they've asked him a question, he says to them, how can the scribes say concerning the Messiah that he's the son of David? Right? When David in his own writings calls him my Lord. How can he be my Lord and my son? So he confounds them and then tells his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to look like something and basically deceive people with their long prayers, and that they'll receive a greater judgment. And chapter 21 opens, Jesus then looked at the rich men who were casting their offerings into the treasury. And he also saw a poor widow who cast in 2 pennies. And he said, truly I say to you that this poor widow has cast in more than every man. For all these cast into the house of the offering of God of their abundance. But she out of her poverty has cast in everything she has earned. And so whether that, I say in the esoteric schools, you'll learn that all these sort of things are written as lessons. They didn't really happen. Jesus didn't really say that. These are lessons attributed to him, and if he said them, it's only because he's an ascended master who was laying down lessons of life, not as they attribute to him, speaking for the Father in the material sense or in the anthropomorphic sense, that he was the story that the Christians point out. The Son of God, as in the only Son of God, and the divine Son of God, and the man that raised from the dead. That's what they deny. But all his teachings that make rational sense like this, that point to a higher purpose or a higher than the ego stance, this is what they use to confuse the subject and show people who Jesus really is, the way they feel. I try to point to it and say that if we're going to claim that our scriptures have any value, if they're really inspired and any of that, well then why shouldn't we believe that what seems most important to Jesus, other than pointing to the people who seem to be the ones and have authority and have knowledge as not being the ones, right? So look at in your Christian church, I find the same things. But also to point that the riches and the desire of riches and the chasing of riches and the worship of mammon is what catches us all, including the people that run the church in his day. He looked at the rich men who were casting their offerings into the treasury. So this isn't even the Pharisees, these are just the rich men, right? The ones in their suits and drive up in their nice cars, and everybody, oh, look how nice they came. They gave $100 to the church. Aren't they lovely? Right? And he also saw a poor woman who cast in 2 pennies. And he said, I tell you. So he grabs hold of this opportunity. Again, even if it's just a fictionalized thing, if this is what, if our scriptures have any meaning, this is the heart of God. This is what Jesus is teaching. Verily I say to you, the poor widows cast in more than every man. And he points out why. They cast in of their abundance, she cast in of her poverty. While some men were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and gift offerings, Jesus said to them, these things which you see will be destroyed. The days will come when not a stone will be left upon a stone, which will not be torn down. And they asked him, saying, Teacher, when will these things happen? And what is the sign when these things are about to happen? He said to them, Be careful that you may not be deceived. For many will come in my name and say, I am the Christ. And the time is near, but do not follow them. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes in different places, and famines and plagues, and there will be alarming sights, and great signs will appear from heaven, and the winters will be severe. But before all these things, they will lay hands on you and persecute you and deliver you to the synagogues and the prisons, and they will bring you before kings and governors for the sake of my name. Now, I've always taught, Dad, or I've understood, that this is at this time of the end. But now, wait a minute. I reread it in Luke, and it seems to me reasonable to think that he goes back to say, but before all these things, because they're asking him when will be the end, when the temple will be destroyed, and they're not asking him when will you come again, yet he knows they're referring to this time of the end. But they're asking, what will be the sign that all these things are about to happen? What things? The temple will be destroyed, not a stone will be left upon another. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that's pretty big when you're living in Herod's temple. They rebuilt the temple after Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century. So it's been around for 5 centuries now. Twice as long as the United States, more than twice as long as the United States. And he's saying, not one stone will be left upon another. As these people, again, is this all just fictionalized, lyricalized, embellished words to tell us something? Well, the story is people are talking, pointing out how beautiful the temple is, and Jesus says, not one stone's going to be left upon another. So whether that conversation took place or not, certainly the prophecy is what's important. And this is what I find these esoteric teachers fail. They'll go ahead and point out that all it is allegorical. But it's a prophecy. Jesus is pointing this out, and they're asking him when. What's the sign? And he's telling them, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they're about to happen? And he said, be careful that you may not be deceived, for many will come in my name and say, I am the Christ, and the time is near. But don't follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be afraid. For all these things must first come to pass, but the end is not yet. And I'm always pointing out, Dad, that's where we are right now. The end is not yet. But we're in the wars and rumors of wars. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in different places. Okay, that's starting to happen. And famines and plagues, right? Necra virus, AIDS, right? All these things are starting to happen in our time. And great signs will appear from heaven. I think we're still looking for such. And the winters will be severe. That also seems to be starting. But before all these things, all these end time things that you're worried about, my friends, my disciples who are asking me, right? Before all these end time things, they will lay hands on you guys, right? That's not us in these days, not the people that not the Jews that turned to Jesus in these days. That's not who it's talking about. It's not who he's talking about. But before all these things, they will lay hands on you and persecute you and deliver you to the synagogues and the prisons. And they will bring you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will be to you for a testimony. It will be to you, my disciples, for a testimony. Just like he told them. Treasure it in your hearts and do not try to learn what to answer. Right? There's nothing you're going to be able to do. Treasure this in your hearts. I mean, it's a heavy thing I'm seeing now. He's telling them, but because they're asking, when's all this temple going to get destroyed? They ain't going to see it, right? They're saying all these end time, he's telling them about all these things that are going to happen. That's perhaps for our benefit. But before all these things, they will lay hands on you and persecute you and deliver you to the synagogues, right? For my name. It will be for you a testimony. Treasure it in your hearts and do not try to learn what to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your enemies will not be able to withstand. See, Christians have always thought that we all get that. BS, bull. That's what he was promising his friends, who are now going to be taken captive for their testimony. And they're going to be taken to the synagogues and put through the same sort of crud that Jesus was. Stop saying this name. This poor guy that we killed, he wasn't the Messiah. They're going to say, yeah, God raised him from the dead. We saw him. He is the Messiah. Right? And that's going to bring them nothing but hell. And they're not going to have any way to answer all their charges when it comes time, when they tell them, we're going to kill you if you'll just say something different. They're not going to have an answer. And the Lord's telling them, I'll give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your enemies will not be able to withstand. You will be delivered up even by your parents and brothers and your relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. See, he's still talking to his friends here, I think. And you will be hated by every man because of my name. That's still these guys, okay? And yet, not a hair of your head will be lost. See, he's promising them. Not a hair of your head will be lost. I will know exactly where you are, what they're doing to you. Not a hair of your head will be lost. He's promising them. By your patience, you will gain your souls. Okay, now that's for them. Now's when it switches back to the question he asked them. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by an army, then you know its destruction is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountain, and let those who are within it flee, and let those who are in the fields not enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, so that everything which is written must be fulfilled. But woe to those who are with child, and to those who give suck in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and they will be taken captive to every country, and Jerusalem will be trodden under the feet of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. Now, Dad, I think we've misunderstood that as well. I think all that's still talking about the destruction of the temple that's to come. Not to come in our time, for them. That's the question they ask. When will all these stones, this temple, these beautiful stones, this Herod's temple, you're saying it's all going to be torn down? When is that going to happen? See, in this kingdom that rises against, he says, but before all that, you guys are going to be handed over to be killed. You'll be hated. Your own fathers and mothers. Some of you will be put to death over this, right? But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by an army, then know that its destruction is at hand, right? Because at that point, Jerusalem had lasted 500 years. How many times had armies come? How many times had God, had something prevailed? But now Jesus is telling them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by an army, know its time's come. So don't run into it. Get lost, because they're going to take you captive again. See, that's not going to happen in the future when the Jerusalem gets destroyed. They're not going to be taken captive anywhere. We already know they're going to be killed to a man by the people that search them out in Jerusalem. A remnant has to flee to a place prepared for them. So that's not this point that he's describing to them. That's not the end times. That's the end of the temple that he's talking about, right? Pointing out to them that the wrath is going to come to this people. Not the day of God's wrath, but and wrath to this people. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and they will be taken captive to every country. See, to every country. Captive to every country. This is the big end of the diaspora. And Jerusalem will be trodden under the feet of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. That's what we're in right now. The time of the Gentiles, till that comes to an end, which won't be until the rebuilding of the temple. It really won't be, I guess, till God returns to that land. I'm not sure how that's got to be measured. But that's the time of the Gentiles. We're in it. When they don't have temple in that land. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on earth distress of the nations and confusion because of the roaring of the sea, and upheaval that takes life out of men because of fear of what is to come on earth. And the powers of the universe will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with a large army and great glory. But when these things begin to happen, have courage and lift up your heads, because your salvation is at hand. Okay, so now we kick back into that. See, until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end, and there will be signs in sun and moon. That's it now, at the time of the end of the Gentiles, right? Because he's just told them how this thing will be destroyed. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by the army, you know to get out of there. That'll be it. And they're going to fall by the sword and be taken captive into every country, and Jerusalem will be trodden under feet until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. That's like 2,000 years long. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars. This is after. This is at this time the way I'm reading it, until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars. And on earth distress of nations and confusion because of the roaring of the sea. An upheaval that takes life out of men because of fear of what is to come on earth. And the powers of the universe will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with a large army and great glory. So this takes us to our, our last 42 months perhaps. Time of the Gentiles comes to an end. What we can see is the correlation in my mind to Revelation and the stuff happening in Revelation. With this signs in sun and moon and stars, and on earth distress of the nations and confusion because of the roaring sea. I'm not sure, because what follows, the way they have the punctuation is with a semicolon, so that and upheaval that takes life out of men because of fear of what is to come on earth, and the powers of the universe will be shaken. That's all as one sentence, the way they have the punctuation, pointing to perhaps, let's say, a meteor that's supposed to, hit into the ocean, and it causes a tidal wave that causes great loss of life. And all of a sudden everybody's screaming about it's the end of the world. Perhaps the war is escalating. It seems to read to me, Dad, to look like to the people who are in it, it's end of the world. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on earth distress of the nations and confusion because of the roaring of the sea, and upheaval that takes life out of men because of fear of what is to come on earth. And the powers of the universe will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with a large army and great glory. But when these things begin to happen, have courage and lift up your heads, because your salvation is at hand. See, it doesn't sound like anybody's been raptured out of the way, right? No warning there, no reference to that. Be part of that group that gets out of the way of that. But when these things begin to happen, have courage and lift up your heads, because your salvation. And this is what I was trying to tie it into. Is that salvation got to do with resurrection? Is that why it's that time? That's why it's at hand, because it's this first resurrection? So anyway, that's where I'm seeing a lot of this flow with the way I'm reading it. And it's been different. That's why I want to reiterate that's a different than the traditional way that I've read what Jesus is recorded to have said. Usually it's Matthew that I've read this story in, so this time it's just happened to be Luke, and perhaps it's the change of scenery, the change of the way they've written it, that gives me a pause. But either way, it makes sense that what he's saying they've asked him, put flesh and blood on it, you guys. You're following around Jesus. This is right toward the end here. You've seen the miracles. You believe as much as is possible, even though his story sounds crazy. He said he's going to die and rise from the dead. Nobody has a metaphysic, as I've pointed out. Nobody teaches that ever. It sounds crazy. He's even told the Pharisees, who have law that, in their law that you can't eat the blood, the Mosaic covenant. Everybody knew that. You got to spill the blood of the animal. And you can eat many of the animals, the clean ones, but you can't eat their blood, even the clean ones. And they knew that. What does Jesus tell them? Unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. Now, I say what I'm learning gives that some perspective. It's not just the way the Christians teach it. The reason they get this Catholic host that is the transfiguration of the body and blood of Christ, and they eat it, is because, of course, in perhaps the dark magic, at least what I'm learning from the mystery schools, it appears that in the darkest of the dark understandings, drinking of the blood, eating of the heart, for instance, and drinking of the blood is where the most spiritual power comes from. And that certainly, if these things come from ancient Egypt, and these are all these blood sacrifices to Molech, and if all that has anything to do with it, then certainly Jesus making that sort of reference to the Pharisees, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. It's like, whoa, he's putting it in these terms of their own esoteric knowledge of eating flesh and drinking blood, and again, probably being ironic to them in that fashion. But again, I see it as the people around him are trying to call him on this claim. He's pointing out that this grand structure that's the center of their universe, there won't be one stone left upon another. And they're saying, wow, when's that going to happen? What's going to be the sign? When is that coming? And so he then goes into this, be careful that no one deceives you, because many will come claiming I'm the Christ and the time is near. Right? Now, remember, they're getting pretty close to the destruction of that temple. So this is why I believe that we need to read into this where Jesus is talking to his children of the future that would be there when this all plays out again with the destruction of Jerusalem, and where he's talking to the people right around him. Because he says, many will come and claim to be the Christ and that the time is near, but don't follow them. And when you hear of wars and revolutions, don't be afraid, for all these things must first come to pass, but the end is not yet. Were they going to hear of wars and revolutions in the 30 or so years, 40 years that it would take until Rome destroyed their temple? Possibly. Is that what he's referring to? For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Is that what was really going on in the 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple then? And there will be great earthquakes in different places, and famines and plagues, and there will be alarming sights, and great signs will appear from heaven, and the winters will be severe. Again, is this all in the 40 years leading up to the destruction of that temple? I'm saying no. I'm saying this is where he's talking about, he's projected that all of these things still have to happen before the very end. Because in Matthew it talks about when are the signs of your coming, that this temple will be destroyed, and the signs of your coming. And so he's working both of them in the same argument, right? Where Luke doesn't mention, he just says, what will be the signs of this, that you're going to tear the temple down? Because it's after he gives this explanation of there'll be great earthquakes and famines and great signs and winters will be severe. But before all these things, they will lay hands on you and persecute you and deliver you to the synagogues and the prisons, and they'll bring you before kings for the sake of my name, and it'll be a testimony. Treasure it in your hearts. And don't try to learn what to answer, for I'll give you a mouth and wisdom which all your enemies will not be able to withstand. You will be delivered up even by your parents and brothers and your relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by every man because of my name, and yet not a hair of your head will be lost. By your patience you will gain your souls. Very important in our whole discussion about this, life and death and afterlife. You'll gain your souls. This whole Jesus telling them, don't worry about the one that can kill your body, but the one that can throw both body and soul into Gehenna like garbage. What's it really take to lose your soul? A few years on this earth just being ignorant and saying there is no God, but loving your neighbor instead? Does that lose you your soul? I doubt it. I really doubt it. But who am I? I'm not God. I don't know. But I doubt it. And if that's the case, then it can't be so important to keep your soul. Because there'll be too many souls lost from our countenance, from our memories. I've realized how important all that is. And why this whole idea, the other side of it for the dragon is getting us to abstain from our ego, to not be ourself, to think of ourselves as an illusion. Because the truth is, ourself is who we must always identify with, even in some other realm. That's why the amazing promise, I think the amazing metaphysic of Jesus or Christians of this resurrection of the body. Because how else could I know my brother if I met him again, to see him again? What would I see? What would be my brother? Just a voice coming out of the ether? Is that my brother? Isn't it the recognition of the personality traits that come from that person? The twitch of the eye, the hairline, the raise of the eyebrow, all these little things, the upturned smile on, all the features that make up the expression between two human beings that are the, at rock bottom, the essence of our experience and what we must be somehow measured by in this judgment of what we've done. What are our works? What are our works based on? But what we conceive as reality through our senses. And so we see other people, we love others based on what we perceive as them through their physical attributes. And if you take away all those attributes, what's left of them for us to perceive? In this dimension, certainly nothing at all. And in the next dimension, well, we just don't know. What do two shades look like? How could I, in this dimension, I can only answer and say, if I saw my brother in Hades or Sheol, there'd have to be something that stood in for a visual recognition. Otherwise, again, how would I know he was my brother? How would I pick out his shade from every other shade, except that shade must stand out? How to me? How? What does my dead brother look like to me, except some sort of representation that I can project all of those attributes onto? And, what is that finally? I don't know. Is it flesh and bone? Is that what the Christian metaphysic is there to demonstrate to us? That what God really did was create these attributes in us, that's the gift of preserving that we might all continue to be this individual, learning to love, right? And being loved, and be around the people that we love to continue that infinitely. I find that these are the difficult, these are the edges of my own understanding, trying to put some sort of mental image to to a spiritual life, to be resurrected. If I wouldn't be able to look in a mirror and see what I call me, what would I see? A little glow like a light bulb? And my brother's a little glow like a light bulb too, and we're both just a couple little glows like a light bulb, like they show sometime in the movies. Well, obviously those two glows must recognize each other, and the part that kind of bends your mind is what would there be to recognize if not features that are apprehendable? And so in this next dimension, let's say in Abraham's bosom, in Sheol, whatever we want to call it, the apprehendability, may or may not have to do with bodies, but there obviously is apprehendability. And when Jesus tells the parable about Lazarus, he sees Lazarus and the rich man. He doesn't, because how else can we relate it in our own dimension? He saw two little shiny lights that recognized each other as Lazarus and Abraham, right? So, anyhow, none of that's really important, but it is sort of the, if you're a thinking Christian, what picture do you put to this resurrected? Are you floating around in the sky? You walk in the earth as a body? Well, then what are these souls that don't die and that don't marry? What is heaven then? So, the esoteric schools with this advancement, and even the Hindu idea of this constant advancement of our own individual soul toward a union with the divine. See, to me, all that makes sense, but only as half the coin. That must be going on too. God must be imparting on us something that requires this experience that we're having. But the experience itself is not the final experience, as Jesus said. In that other world, we'll be like the angels of God and the sons of God. Neither go in marriage and nor die. And I say that's that final resurrection when all things are made new again. We got a long way to go in between here and there. But with regards to what he told about the signs of his coming, again, I think he's speaking, first to the question of these wars and rumors of wars, kingdoms will rise against nations. All these things, don't let anyone fool you. Don't let anyone deceive you to think that the time's at hand when it's not yet. All these things are going to happen, but before any of that, you guys are going to be mostly killed and deserted and hated by everyone. But don't worry, not a hair of your head will be lost, and by your patience you'll gain your souls. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by an army, then you know its destruction's at hand. I say that I'm still going to say that's back then, because it ends with until the time of the Gentiles comes to an end. And I say that's us now. We're at the time of the Gentiles coming to an end, when we should be looking forward to, and there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on earth distress of nations, and confusion because of the roaring of the sea, and upheaval that takes life out of men because of fear of what is to come on earth, and the powers of the universe will be shaken. I say that's what's coming. And I think we're very fortunate that it's probably it comes in a short period of time. It comes in a 42-month period, of which we will be quite aware because it starts with a 7-year covenant, and so we have a warning. And we'll know exactly what's going on at that point, and we'll know to have courage and lift up our eyes, because the time of our redemption will be at hand. And so anyway, it's a pretty darn exciting time, I think, Dad, and I'm finding it very exciting to uncover the scriptures that, for me, confirm that our story really is, I don't hear the esoteric schools answering for these things that we see in the world through prophecy come to pass all through history. And that the teaching and that the things Jesus say as these signs, the true signs, are never accounted for in their teachings nor undermined. And so anyway, I remember I'm still trying to find the strength of the argument against their argument, so that when these times come, there's at least one Christian station that anticipates what they're trying to say about us and has an argument for them, so that perhaps some people searching at that time can look toward this discussion and find some answers. And hopefully we're delineating some truth that others might hear. Anyway, that's our goal, and it's also we might verify in our own heart that Jesus is Lord, and that Jesus is real, that Jesus was a man who was vindicated by coming out of the grave. And it's okay to doubt that. Thomas doubted it. His own guy who followed him around doubted it and said, I won't believe it unless I see. I mean, that's our myth, that's our legend, that's our story. And so I can believe that. I can believe there was at least one of them that said, yeah, it'd be nice to think he came out of the grave, but I'm not believing that unless I see it. I'm not falling for one of these magic tricks. And so he did see it. I've never seen it. I've had to believe this story, and so I don't think he minds that I doubt it and test it and question it and prove it to myself. And the nice part is I do keep finding that, I keep trying to find a better story. I'm listening to these esoteric guys, waiting for them to, I'm very impressed by the fact that they have a metaphysic that I've had to discover after, 30 years of being a Christian and never seeing how shallow my own metaphysic was. But after sorting that out, I see that they have a metaphysic, but their story's kind of shallow. They don't have an answer for me being an individual. They don't have an answer for what am I going to be when I unite with the divine. How does love fit into any of that? It seems like it's all about me. It's all about me fighting my ego. And love is really a selfish tool for me to demonstrate how much ego I've fought. See, not as a purposeful tool that my ego binds itself to, because my master bound himself to that tool, because he told me that to be the greatest servant was the highest goal. And because my master told me that, even though it doesn't seem so rational and look so good, I believe that that's the way toward eternal life, is to try and be the greatest servant, to try and detach from, not from my ego, but from what my ego wants for me, and allow myself to want that for others, rather than wanting all of us to be egoless. No, I want others to have love. I want others to have abundance. I want others to have health. I want others to have comfort at my expense, if I can possibly bring myself to do that. But I believe that's the Christian message. And so, anyway, if this Bible study's helping anybody achieve that, then I'm really happy about that. Appreciate you all being here, and God bless. Talk to you next week.